Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Everyday Sublime podcast. I'm your host, Josh Summers, and it is an honor and pleasure to have you here, as always. And in today's episode, I am joined by Miles Sherts, insight meditation teacher, communication expert, and in addition to announcing that we're syndicating our own show on the Everyday Sublime podcast, the show will be called Miles on the Path, exploring the integration of contemplative wisdom in everyday modern life. In this particular episode titled How to Love Thy Neighbor, we explore the timeless issues of human conflict and how attending to your feelings and needs in communication can really help mitigate or de-escalate conflict. So I'm super excited about this episode, about the series that Miles and I will continue to do, and all the other developments in this podcast. If you're a yin yoga practitioner or a yoga practitioner and looking to feel more vital, more alive, more clear-headed, do check out our link in the show notes for the course that Terry and I built called Everyday Vitality, 4 Ways to Feel Better Now. It's a free 4-part course that you will give to you as soon as you subscribe to our newsletter. Again, there's a link for you in the show notes. And in very simple ways, we hear this over and over again from our students, you'll just feel more energized, more vitalized, more excited to be a part of your life. So check that out. And I hope you enjoy today's conversation with Miles. Do subscribe in your favorite podcast player. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Thank you so much. And without further ado, enjoy the show. Miles, welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Hi, Josh. I'm doing really well. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So, as I just mentioned before we hit the record button, the podcast, Everyday Sublime Podcast, is being rebranded this fall. And part of the rebrand is that we are now including video episodes on YouTube and Spotify. So 2 different channels with video options. So more ways that people can follow us. And really, in recognition of this rebrand, I just want to announce that the conversations you and I are having are going to be hopefully ongoing. Our intention is to have ongoing chats about the way in which, if I were to frame it broadly, we're talking about ways that practitioners, either from a yoga background or an insight meditation background, but how practitioners can take the things they cultivate on their cushion or on their practice mat and bring those tools that they cultivate into their life of engagement with others, namely with other people, their relationships, their work colleagues, their neighbors, in a way to really bring the essence of the Dharma or the liberating teachings of the Buddha into their life to reduce unnecessary conflict. And, you are an insight meditation teacher yourself. You're a communication expert. You work with couples on navigating communication to reduce conflict and bridge or create more connections of understanding, empathy, collaboration, harmony even. And to tee up our conversation today, which is we're in the end of September 2024, right before probably what everyone says feels like the most consequential presidential election in our lifetime. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but it feels that way to me.
Mm-hmm.
By mentioning that, I'm trying to acknowledge an environment that everybody feels like they're in right now of extreme polarization, whether it's with friends, neighbors, family members. I know from the past cycles of these presidential races, conflicts start cropping up everywhere, whether it's about the politics or not, but people are kind of on edge. And I know you've written about this in your own blog, but one of the things I wanted to try to get into today with you is to provide listeners concrete examples of tools and skills that they can use to help them navigate these situations better, these tensions, these polarizations better. We can get into it. I have a personal story related to the situation with my neighbor.
that speaks to this. I see it as a microcosm of the macrocosm. And we had also identified from our last conversation something I think we were referring to as the archaeology of the ego. In that, in our last conversation, to pick up where we left off, you were speaking a lot about how the problems we see in the world, like the conflicts between whether it's nations, between tribes, between individuals, the conflicts we see in the world at their root are rooted in a false perception of self-image, namely the ego, that, as you kind of put it, the inevitable result of that perception is conflict. So as long as that perception of separation, of selfness, of ego-ness is at the center of someone's perception or driving someone's perception, conflict will result. You've explored in the past how language and communication actually can reinforce that sense of separation. And so in light of the context we're in, I just wanted to tee us up with those kinds of themes. Look, how did this sense of separation or egoic sense of self evolve over time? We can talk about that, and then I would like to move into some real world examples and skills that people might be able to use to, again, help them navigate this moment where it just feels like I feel like I am stepping on eggshells with every person I meet. Whether something's mentioned about politics or something's mentioned about the climate or something's mentioned about and it's like emotions are high, somatic sensations are in chaos. Myself and the people I work with, we're all feeling this. So I'm really looking forward to having this timely conversation and episode with you. How did that sound to you? What did you pick up on, and what do you remember, and what do you think where you'd like to take this?
Yeah, those are we can cover a lot of ground with that intro. Did you want to share a story? Did you want to start with did I hear that right, that you had a story about a conflict that you're having?
Yeah, it's a situation. I would describe it as a conflict. It's been going on for a while. I would say it reached an acute phase this year in April. So my wife and I, we live on a 5-acre plot in Maine, and on our back border, our property is neighboring a 6-acre field, which had been empty for the first 3 years that we've been living here. And about a year or two ago, the field sold. And for a while, we thought the neighbor was digging their foundation. There was a lot of earth being moved in the corner of the field. And we just assumed, purchase of land, digging, there's a house going to go in. This must be the foundation. We learned in April of this year, on Easter actually, that the digging wasn't for the foundation. The digging was digging up earth to form what are known as berms, piles of dirt at which people shoot their guns to, the berms collect the bullets basically, or prevent the bullets from flying outside of the gun range. But we learned that this neighbor was building and wanted to install a gun range on his property. And the site of the gun range was going to be just over the 100-yard margin from our house that he needed to clear in order to be able to be compliant with Maine law on gun regulation, gun shooting. So there's a situation, neighbor coming in, building this gun range, bringing up all sorts of fear for us of our safety, value of our property, the environment of the neighborhood. Other neighbors were up in arms. And that's setting the stage. And I could talk more about how well the interactions went with this neighbor, and how the conflict developed. And in a way, I'm mentioning it as an example because it's an example where I know I did not communicate as effectively or as skillfully or as well as I would have liked to navigate this in a way that I think it could have gone better than it has. Yeah. But it has gotten into culture. It's like on the back border of our property, the culture war has flared up. Political signs appeared. And it's taken a pretty unpleasant flavor in our life. And so I think it's a good example of, to the point that tonight I'm even having dinner with another neighbor who needs to speak to the neighbor with the gun range. And he's coming over to literally have dinner with me to talk through how he can approach talking him. And I'll tell you that what I'm going to be sharing with him is much of your skills around communication in terms of naming facts, feelings, outcomes, impacts, needs. This framework and these skills is, as I've said before, I feel like is incredibly helpful theory and practice for navigating these kinds of really unpleasant conflicts.
Yeah.
So that's the example, and we can unpack it more. But
okay,
I just wanted to set the stage there.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with that a little bit. You've shared that with me before. I'm sorry that's happening. That's that has to be a really difficult situation for you and your wife. Not something that most of us would want to deal with.
Yeah, and people that have followed, or in the Sangha that we lead, they know that there's been some resolution in that. My wife and I built a small meditation hut at the corner of our property, which effectively shut down his margin of distance to be able to shoot. So the structure it's like a game of chess. We built a little meditation hut temple. Now he's within 100 yards. He can't shoot where he meant to. And then another neighbor put in a chicken coop on their property. So now this neighbor can't shoot anywhere. So the primary need of feeling safe has been met. Like he can't shoot, but the way we got there, it wasn't collaborative. It hasn't engendered good feelings as neighbors. And it's one of these situations.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to pull a thread that you laid down in the beginning. You said that from previous conversations with me, the idea that the ego is the cause of the conflict. And I just want to very simply lay that out once more in terms that will make the rest of the conversation hopefully make more sense. One way to think of it is that in order to have the illusion of an ego, so we're, whatever else we want to say about ego, it's an idea, it's a concept. And Buddha was very clear that it's an illusion. It's not real. And it's our allegiance to it or our attraction to it. I think of it as our addiction to it. That's the cause of the suffering that we experience as humans. That's a very simple distillation of Buddha's teaching. And another way to frame that's been very helpful to me is that the concept of the ego, the illusion of it appearing, for the ego to appear real, it has to contrast itself with something that it's not. So it creates duality. It's the mechanism that generates the illusion of ego automatically creates an other in our life and for us to be good and right and true, the other has to be wrong and bad. So we create enemies by virtue of our attraction and our addiction and our allegiance to our ego. So that's what I mean by conflict comes with the ego. It's not, it's serving the purpose of creating the illusion of me as a separate self. And that's something for listeners to explore in their own lives on their own. That, as all these teachings are not meant to be beliefs, they're not meant to be repeated as such. They're meant to be cues for you to explore in your own self-awareness practice, whatever that is, however you're learning about yourself and the internal workings of your mind. This is something that you can check out. You can watch how your mind will. So a word for this is demonize. So what our tendency is to create an other in our lives, and then that other, the more we demonize that other, the worse we can make them look, the more evil and threatening we can create that image of the other, the stronger we feel our ego gets. So it's a purely feeding ego phenomena, and the consequence of it is tragic. It's that we require, in order to have an ego, we require having an enemy. You can't have one without the other. And so you've been talking about skills that I teach, and I just want to name them. I call them conscious communication skills, similar to what some people know as the nonviolent communication model. And we can weave those into this conversation. I love that you're finding them useful. And the main theme there is to recognize that when we demonize somebody else, that we separate from them mentally, emotionally, we see them as not us, as something else. And that then justifies hurting them or treating them badly. That's how humans have done it throughout all our history that we know, is that when we feel threatened by another culture, another people, another tribe, we create an image of them as bad people, as evil, trying to hurt us, and that justifies us doing things that hurt them, and that perpetuates the conflict. So the main thing with politics right now, and this can apply in some way to your issue with your neighbor, is what I would encourage all of us to do is notice our mind wanting to demonize whatever the other is. And if it's politics in the current setting, it's maybe whether you lean Republican or Democrat, watch your mind tending to demonize the other party. I lean blue, I lean left, I lean liberal. That's kind of immaterial, but what I don't think is helpful for anybody is to see the other party as inherently evil. How I look at the conservatives or Republicans is just that they have a different approach. I think we want the same thing. We want security. We want peace. We want safety. I think those are universally human needs that we all want. And when we look at another opposite other, what we can focus on is, they're trying a different strategy to get there. For example, everybody wants peace. I don't think you're going to talk to any human being that says, I love war, I want war. What people that are in, backing or let's say, just talk about violence. The use of violence is to attain a sense of peace, a sense of, if you eliminate what you perceive as the enemy, if you eliminate them, then what's left is peace, because there's a sense of similarity about everybody that's left. And so that's just a strategy. It's a strategy for achieving peace, and it's been the default human strategy for a long, long time, and it also doesn't work. Right? The more we push. So to bring it home to your situation, what you're learning with your neighbors, that the more you push against them, the harder that they push back. And there is merit, there is value. I think it's worth saying that sometimes we need to put up boundaries for our own protection. So not feeding conflict. You can have a clear boundary and not feed the conflict. So the way to do that is to not demonize that person in your heart. So when you think of your neighbor, you can put your meditation hut on the border, whatever, or confront them in the town or the state or the court or whatever means. You can use whatever means are available to set boundaries with them. And it sounds like this is a difficult person to set. Could be a difficult person to set boundaries with. And you can do that without making them an enemy. You can do that without thinking of them as evil. And that's the art of it. That's the dance of, and the reason for that, I just want to conclude this by saying, the reason for that is not to be a good person or a spiritual person, or not to be righteous. Forgiving other people, giving them the benefit of the doubt, not demonizing people, not making enemy images of them, is not so that you can be a good person. It's so that your life, your world is now whole again. When we demonize somebody, when we follow, we're influenced by the ego and its programming to make these others out of whoever is different from us, whoever we feel threatened by. When we do that, our world splits. And when our world splits, our personal integrity is compromised. We now live in a fragmented world, and it's because in our mind we're separating ourselves from the other. And as I said, that's the method of the ego that will come with the ego. So the point I'm trying to make now is that it's not some sort of a spiritual achievement to be able to love your neighbor. It's so that your world is not fragmented. It's for your benefit. It's for my benefit to not demonize others. Because when I can see the humanity in another person, when I can see them as more similar to me than different, when I can see them as part of myself, my world becomes full. And that's how we evolve spiritually. That's how we undo our addiction to ego and evolve spiritually. And I'll just say one more time that in doing that, you also can set clear boundaries. You can put the meditation hut on the edge of the property. I wouldn't consider that an act of aggression. I think what you meant was that it's not a very direct way to deal with it's not like sitting down with the person and working something out. It's, as you mentioned, sort of a game of chess. It's a bit of a power play. But if that's what needs to happen, that can happen. If your work then, in my judgment, is to put a place in your heart open for this person and notice that they are a human being as you are a human being. They suffer as you suffer. They probably want some of the same things you want, and they are, from appearances, just have a very different way of going about trying to meet that need.
Yes. Yeah. Good stuff. Great. I was hitting the magic clip marker there. There were some good clips. I'd like to dial in on a few things. The theme of demonization and its relationship to dehumanization. The reason I want to dial in on that is that I hear it everywhere. And I can see it. And in this instance with my neighbor, I was very aware of that dynamic taking root. And as you said, we want to stop demonizing, not because it's like an attainment of spiritual attainment, but it's because when we demonize it, the fact that we're doing it, it's because the ego's perception is reigning or in control, and that in itself is self-limiting. So the phrase that came to me as I was listening to is, it's really in everyone's enlightened self-interest to both perceive when they're in an egoic mode, to feel the consequences. And I want to kind of, what I want to unfold or unpack with you are the symptoms. Like, how can someone recognize, and I can use my own example of how I can recognize when I was in a dynamic of demonization or an egoic mindset where I was demonizing this neighbor, and how that led to an inability to communicate well, which led to a further escalation of tension at the border. And then how I have tried to use communication differently and with varying degrees of success at this point. But I mean, I hear it everywhere at the political level too. And so you mentioned, and I just want to be transparent, like you, also lean blue. I've been, except for one very strange election it was in the late 80s. I pulled the trigger for some random character, but my voting history is blue. So I have my own blue bias, I would say. But in the recent election cycles, I'm aware that I have gone into patterns of demonizing the right as well as demonizing the left. So my tendency to demonize is not just one way or the other. It's like I have problems with people on all fronts in a way. And when I come back to the example of this gun range, and how I've interacted with a neighbor. Every other neighbor around has said something like, couldn't he have just walked around to each of our doors and introduced himself and said this is what his intention was and let us know when he was planning to shoot, which is sort of standard etiquette, I gather, from country living. He didn't do that. He just started shooting. And that brought up so much fear for us. Like we could no longer take our morning walk in fear that if he was happened to be in the shooting range, an errant bullet, we would be vulnerable to being potentially shot. So there's a level of survival that I was brought to in a way that I'd never been brought to in my adult life before. So the level of emotional pitch was extremely high. And as a meditator, as I look back at how I interacted from that place of extreme emotional pitch, I didn't have any wherewithal to communicate calmly or in a balanced way, to speak about, a clear event like, well, when this happened, I felt these emotions and the impact is this, and that this unmet need of mine is now not being met. I couldn't navigate any of that. There was such a sense of certainty of being right, which I think is something that everybody that sounds passionate about their politics is feeling. Everybody has a sense that they are right, their group is right, the other group is this demonic conspiracy to take down the world. And so it's not just me in relationship to my neighbor at this level of pitch, it's widespread through the collective.
Yeah.
People listening, like one pragmatic skill would be, how do you recognize when your own mind is caught? And what kinds of symptoms would you be able to look for in some way someone's communicating or speaking?
Yes. All right. Yeah. So you just put your finger on, I think, one of the most available indicators that we're caught, which is the idea that I'm right. So very, very simple thing. So this is for people listening that want to learn about themselves. If you're determined to win the whatever the struggle is, whatever the fight is, at all costs, then this podcast probably isn't for you. But if you're interested, and I appreciate everything you're saying, Josh, you're saying, yeah, you've had a long history of working on yourself. You've spent hours on the cushion, and I know this, I've sat with you, and then here you are confronted with what you're describing. And I think for a lot of us in North America would be one of the most threatening situations. We're very fortunate that is the most threatening situation, right? Most of us have not actually had people shooting bullets at us, but a lot of people around the world do. So we're very fortunate that the level of something like that can bring us right up to our maximum stress level. And that sounds like that's what happened to you, and completely understandable. You probably moved to Maine to be in a very quiet, rural environment. And suddenly, you've got almost the most violent expression of our culture right next door, and it's loud and potentially deadly. So the thing for people that want to use this for self-awareness, the first thing to consider is some of your basic needs aren't being met: safety, security, a sense of safety and security, let's say. When you notice that, notice the emotions, notice the energy in your body of not feeling safe, not feeling secure, and it'll be jangled, it'll be tight, there'll be places in your body that are all constricted, and that's the thing to focus on. And then realize that, oh, I'm scared. This is fear. This is like real terror, basic fear. This is what it looks like and feels like in my body. And then how do you take care of yourself? What do you do when you're scared? How does Josh take care of Josh? This is a very internal, personal thing. How does Miles take care of Miles? And how we do that is self-empathy, self-compassion, as we soften around the fear and we realize, oh, I'm scared. Yeah, I can understand why I'm scared. And then self-soothing is very different than numbing. right? There's a tendency when we're emotionally charged and it's a traumatic event, we're beyond the level that we can manage. There's a tendency to go to substances to numb. I'm not talking about numbing. I'm talking about self-soothing, things that make you feel better inside, internally. And that's where we need to focus when we're distressed. And what our ego conditioning makes us do instead of that is focus our energy on the other person, what we think is the cause. So clear, in your case, there's a clear, you know, person to focus on, your neighbor that's causing this. It wasn't happening before your neighbor came. If your neighbor wasn't into guns like this, it wouldn't be happening probably. So you focus on them. It's what the ego conditioning makes us do. And in doing that, you abandon yourself. That's really the simple but really significant lesson we can all learn from these situations is you abandon yourself. And instead of taking care of your need for safety and security, you substitute that for being right. So the ego is always focused on being right because then it gets to contrast itself with someone else who's wrong. In order for you to be right, there has to be somebody else who's wrong. And in that contrast, the illusion, the image of the ego gets stronger. So it's how we maintain that image of an individual self that's separate from the world around it. And that's the only thing that benefits from being right. The only thing that benefits from being right is your ego image. And it's a strong, powerful addiction. It's just like the ego. So that wanting, that urge to be right is very strong. And as you're saying, that's what you're hearing in the political environment that we're in right now is, but notice that, and you can build that to a fever pitch. I'm right. You can build that to a fever pitch, but all we're doing when we do that is feeding the ego. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not a sin to feed the ego. It's not a crime, but it's a tragedy because then you're not feeding yourself. So instead of when you feel that, and you can do this every day. The thing about having a neighbor situation like you're in is that this will be food for you to work on every day. Maybe not every day, but it's there in your life. And when you have a situation like that, you can gradually try these different experiment with it. And what I'm encouraging you to experiment with is when you feel that, I can't believe I've got a neighbor that's shooting guns. It's just wrecked my world and my home, and this place that was my sanctuary no longer feels like a sanctuary. When that's up, when that anxiety and that fear is up in you, just notice your mind. There's two directions, and one is that guy's the enemy, that guy's the problem. I have to deal with that guy, my neighbor. Or, oh, I need nourishment. I need comfort. I need to comfort myself. I'm scared. I need to comfort myself. Those are two very different directions. And you can comfort yourself, take care of yourself, and kind of regain your sense of inner peace. And then you can take steps to address the neighbor situation. It's not a either or. But if you don't take care of yourself, then nobody's taking care of you. And these situations happen so that we can learn to take care of ourselves, so that we can learn that our first primary responsibility is tending to our own being, our own nervous system, our own sense of well-being. And that as we learn to tend to that, that builds resilience. Then less and less and less can take that away from you. You can have a neighbor that's acting the way your neighbor's acting. You can have people in your life threatening you, confronting you, and you can turn that attention inward to comforting yourself so that you can be at peace. And then be a more, you said that in your state of stress and anxiety, you don't believe you communicated as clearly as you would have liked to with your neighbor. When you first take care of yourself and you feel some sense of inner peace, it's not going to be complete. It won't be totally resolved. That'll set you up. If you do have a conversation with the person who you think is responsible, it'll be a more grounded, productive, centered conversation in which you're expressing your feelings and your needs, and you're not blaming and judging that.
And yes, to all of that, I would just add in my humble experience of essentially trying to practice what you're teaching. And I really, at a cognitive level, so appreciate the clarity, the simplicity, the specificity of the way you're communicating, taking care of oneself, taking accountability for what you're experiencing, comforting yourself. I want to open up, people that have been listening are familiar with yogic, meditative approaches around that. We can loop back to that a little bit. And I am, and I don't know if I'm unique. I don't think I'm terribly unique on this, but as a practitioner, as you said, for many years, I just want to add my voice to the difficulty in accessing this kind of skill set or these kinds of resources, accessing these when the stakes are high. And for example, today in our meditation morning session, I was just using your structure there of naming a fact, identifying the feeling, maybe speaking to the story or the impact. And I was just drilling that exercise with simple things like, what's the fact of how your breathing feels? What's the sensation of your breathing? What's the emotional feeling connected to that? And what's stories that spin up, just so that people can identify these different layers or different fields of their experience. That alone is difficult to differentiate between these different domains of things. To do it when the stakes are high, though, is, I say, for me, is incredibly difficult. And to the point that even I was having a phone call with one of my sisters yesterday, and it was a neutral phone call. We were just catching up. But I was aware that there were some topics that came in where I started to feel like, okay, if I misstep here, if I say the wrong thing, I could get into trouble. I was trying to apply your conscious communication skills as best I could. And even having read the book a few times, having talked to you now, this is the fourth interview, I've immersed myself in your work. I can still say in the moment, even in a low stakes moment, smoothly deploying these skills isn't so easy, is not so easy. And I feel that some of the listeners know that I'm trying to learn jazz saxophone again. And once a week I rehearse with a band in Maine. And, the way I describe it is 95% of the time I sound bad objectively. There's about 5% of the time where I play something that is what I would define as musically respectable, getting in the right direction, but it's only 5% of the time. 95% of the time, I sound not so good. But I practice. I show up each week and I'm looking for finding and training. How do I find a flow with what's happening and be able to speak in that flow with greater clarity and something of interest to say. And it's no different in these in the moment conversations with people around with conflicts and tensions. I would say 90% of the time I'm stumbling around trying to remember okay, what are they feeling? And when things get triggered in me, or when the energy of emotion gets high, I'm just more appreciative of how difficult it is to access. And so when the neighbor came over the first time to talk to us, 3 weeks after he'd shot up the berms on Mother's Day, or Easter, whenever he did, just him walking into our yard, my heart was already pounding before he even knocked at the door. And I know, at that point I made disparaging remarks about what he's done to the environment of the neighborhood, and wife made disparaging remarks about the aesthetics of his house. And, we said things that were in our not going to help us understand each other, what's going on anymore. We've had some, I'd say, some communication more recently that was more aligned with just neutral, nonviolent communication, just trying to understand what's going on. And it's getting a little bit better. But I just want to once again say, just particularly now, and I hear a lot of my friends are practitioners, meditators, yogis. But if the subject of politics comes up, like the emotion is there, the demonization is there, the black and white thinking is there, and it doesn't really matter how much they practice or not. It's very hard to stay balanced in a way. So I just wanted to give you that feedback to what you were just saying.
I mean, it's worth saying over and over again that these skills are really difficult to use. We're talking now more about communication skills as well as meditation. I mean, I've taught meditation now for 30 some years. And what I realized early on is that for most people, it's nearly impossible to, to sit still with your own mind is what most people spend their life avoiding doing. And here we are in meditation practice, doing it intentionally. And so, the key with skills, meditation, communication, those are the two medicines that I teach, the two skill sets I found the most useful, is begin where you are and don't, the tendency of the mind, and this is an egoic, another what I call effect of the ego is that we're constantly measuring. We're measuring ourselves, we're measuring each other, and that's not helpful. It's not about getting it right. It's not about learning. So now I learn the skill, so now I'm going to get it right. That's the way our mind tends to frame it. But it's where the wisdom is where am I? Where's my edge? And so I'm teaching more and more to how can you, and you really alluded to this at the beginning of the program today is, how do we find that edge? How do we know when we're, adhering to the ego's tenets? How do we know when we're feeding the ego? How can we tell? So those are edges. And a simple way to tell is when in my mind, or they're wrong, either one. And so just notice that, for those people that want more self-awareness, just begin to notice how frequently that happens. And you don't have to do anything about it. You don't have to change it, but bring it into awareness. And the same with, when you describe your neighbor walking in, of course, that would be one of the most high stress, tense moments a person could experience. And the thing is to notice the energy in your body. Just notice if you're meditating, you're more aware of your body. That's what happened to me when I started meditating. I didn't understand that this was what it was about for a long time, but then I realized this is really about just feeling my body again and feeling all the sensations in it. And it doesn't matter so much what they are. The edge that we're trying to find is how can I be in touch with my body? So when the neighbor walks in the door, just notice that surge of energy, and just that moment of noticing will take a bit of the edge off it, because instead of focused on them, you're focusing on yourself. So it's really baby steps is what we're talking about here, and not trying to, and in my work, I've just learned to keep the skills, the theory as simple as possible. Just
Yep. So let's drill into the issue of playing the edge and tracking sensation, because yin yoga, which a lot of the listeners are practice that are attending to follow us practice. There's a tenet of playing one's edge in a posture. So you never want the sensations to get intense, but you are seeking mild, moderate sensations wherever you're working in the posture. But you have to play the edge with those sensations, and every student is going to be at a different edge and have a unique sensation profile. So the student is really in charge of playing their edge, not the teacher.
Yeah.
And I think what I have found in communication, if I try to transpose that principle of playing the edge in a physical asana to communication, is that as I track my inner landscape of sensations, there's a certain register of sensation, a certain height of pitch, where I know that if I'm feeling that and I speak, I'm going to get, it's just going to be a disaster. And so when I reach the red zone, I need to ideally politely excuse myself and say, I need to take some time out and go take a walk. I think that gets into what you're talking about, the comforting oneself in a certain sense, taking responsibility and learning how to comfort yourself. I'll even say when I do that, majority of the time, I don't even take a time out well. I usually just walk off, or I say, if you're going to talk to me in that way, then I'm going to take some time. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to take some time off. So it's inevitably slip in a little bit of blaming the other person for my need to take a time out, which is not ideal. I know that's not ideal, but I'm just, and because I'm speaking, you work with couples, and I've shared in the past that, my wife and I, we are a home-based husband-wife business couple now, a couple that run a business together. And it's so easy for us to get into like the slight tone of an answer can really set us off. And I'm very familiar with watching these kinds of escalations and when and where my internal state is giving me the signal that I'm in trouble or that I'm in a dangerous spot. And so in tracking that I'm more clearly recognizing there's times when it's okay for me to speak. It would be a good idea, and times where it's better for me to hold my tongue for a while. That's one first step, but then of playing the edge. But then once I recognize that I'm at an internal temperature where I feel like it's okay to communicate, then to actually still use language that's not going to elicit some kind of reaction or feed reactions in the conversation. That's still like a work in progress for me. And I think, I've sent you some articles I've seen in the New York Times about ways of de-escalating communication. But I think even just reviewing some of these phrases and how they might apply in, say, my neighbor situation or in a political conversation that people are probably having, how people might actually, both through their own somatic awareness and just touching through these communications tools, find ways that they can have more resources for themselves in these situations.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned a really key one for couples and any situation, but I teach this really primary for couples is being able to take a time out, what I call an adult time out. And you have to give it to yourself. You can't give it to each other. And you're describing that beautifully. So that's self-awareness. And I notice, I also want to comment on the yin yoga, the leaning into. I love
playing the edge. Yeah,
playing the edge. I love that about yoga. That I'm not yoga's a real peripheral form for me, but I use a little bit every day. And what's helped me the most in understanding it is just finding the edge where I'm a little bit uncomfortable and leaning into it to the point, not causing pain, but feeling that discomfort. Because when I feel the discomfort, I'm opening a part of my body. I'm stretching a muscle. I'm expanding. That's the principle that we're talking about here. And with emotion, it's just more subtle, and we have less. What's beautiful about yoga is it's taught so many of us how to feel our body. And meditation, as I said, really brought me into my body. And the yoga is sort of how do you play with that being in the body and really feel it and open it, and how good it feels when I do that, when I open and expand my body. So we can have the same experience with ourselves emotionally, and we can use the same kind of concept, is leaning into an emotion. So notice that our tendency is to want to feel calm and peaceful all the time. We go to great lengths to set up our environment so nothing disturbs us. If we start to feel disturbed, a lot of us will turn to substance, on something that will numb us or calm us. We're really into, and what I'm learning as I age is I'm learning to really value the disturbance, the feeling of fear or the feeling of pain or the feeling of sorrow, the feeling of joy. The emotions, when they get strong, are now, they create a texture for me that I'm really craving. And it's different from being sort of addicted to anger. We can get addicted to the hormones that are released when we go into rage. But I'm talking about more just feeling, and that what I want to encourage listeners to do is just lean into that the same way you would lean into a yoga posture. Is when you start feeling something, feel it as a physical sensation in the body, and then lean into it a little bit. Feel, don't, instead of, notice the tendency to want to run away from it, to want to shut it down, to want to numb or turn it, ignore it, turn away from it, and see if you can stand still in the face of a sensation in the body and feel it, lean into it a little more. And as we do that, we gain awareness, and it's our awareness that it's the awareness of the situation that brings us present and allows us to have our full conscious faculties. So we don't, I hear as you talk about using the communication skills model, there's a tendency for us to think, I'm not getting it right. Not but what you are getting right is you're aware that you're not getting it right. You're aware that there's an alternative to what you're doing. You're aware that when you're communicating, you're blaming, for example. That awareness, you're getting it right. You're aware of that. If you were blaming and you weren't even aware that you were blaming, then there's nothing to do. There's nowhere to go. But if you're blaming and you're aware you're blaming, then you're on it. And just lean into that and feel, oh, this is what it feels like to blame. And then, be curious about it. Ask yourself, like, what am I getting out of blaming this person? Maybe it's good. Maybe it's good. Maybe they deserve it. Maybe I'm right on. But ask yourself that. What do I get from making them wrong? And my challenge to people is, in the end, that doesn't serve you. It looks like it does because it's serving ego. It's feeding ego to make them wrong, to blame them, but it's not serving you. But that's a theory. That's something you don't enter it with that theory. You enter it with, look at that. I'm blaming it. How does that feel in my body to blame? And what am I getting out of it? So it's more just whatever the sensation is, whatever the experience is, to bring some level of inquiry, some level of curiosity, whatever level you can bring to it, or witnessing it. And the way you describe when your neighbor walked in the door, that surge of emotion that came up in you, that's self-awareness. And self-awareness is the medicine. It's what will heal us. It's what will bring us into this more conscious, more present, more aware state, and ultimately make us happy. It's about undoing the condition of suffering. And the way we do that is increasing awareness. And to increase awareness, you just start where you are. There's no, if you try to measure your awareness and compare it with other people, you just go right back into ego stuff. So it's not about measuring. It's about, just like in yoga, you said everyone has a different threshold of where their edge is. So that's the key here, is that it doesn't matter where your edge is. Your neighbor has an edge. It doesn't matter where that edge is. But the key is, if that person wants to be happier, their challenge is to be aware of their edge and lean into it a little bit. Be willing to be a little uncomfortable. This is not in any way meant to diminish the situation you're in or the experience you're having. Having a situation like what you're in is, as I mentioned earlier, it's food for your practice, because it's there, it's constant. And if you just, even after this conversation, just notice how there are times when you might feel present enough to lean into it a little bit. And right now you're probably wanting to just not feel those feelings. Those are not welcome feelings. And what I'm inviting you to do is, when you feel capable, when you feel, it's a good moment for you, lean into those feelings. Think about your neighbor and just lean into those feelings with self-awareness. Don't get absorbed in the energy of that, but just lean into and find it in your body. Like, where's that in my body? That feeling of, I wish this wasn't happening.
So on that topic, as I have reflected on the experience of sensation, the feeling of physical sensations, and as I reflected on feelings and thoughts, and as I've tried to make sense of, say, some of the teachings of the Buddha around this, to be mindful of bring mindfulness to the body, mindfulness to feelings, mindfulness to the mind or sankhara, etc. In talking with people about this, my observation is that yoga folks tend to be good about naming their sensations: tension, stretch, burning, tingling. They can name their sensations. When they start to speak about their feelings, I feel like I hear primarily stories. And we may have even gotten to this before a little bit, but people read it in a book by Nancy Van Dyke, and she said when people speak about their feelings, they tend to use a sentence statement like, I feel that. And then I feel that because they put this there, that that they're being rude and da, 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 I feel a kind of a degree of I feel offended. So there's a way that the internal process that you're speaking to around identifying what's going on inside, doing the U-turn to look at what's going on inside, and uncoupling the feelings from call it, in this case, the egoic stories, like the I use the phrase today, the internal media industrial complex,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I may have gotten that from you too. But you know what I'm getting at? It's like, I want to speak to, how do you help people? How do you describe it? But to really tease out and differentiate what's a sensation, how is a sensation different from a feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about that in conventional ways and Buddhist ways, because I know they're not often the same. How does making that differentiate ultimately to this resolution of suffering? Because I think it's a key part of it. Just being able to see story as story and not be kind of completely lost in story.
Yep.
So for me, the ballast of the body, when I've practiced, has primarily been a tool so that I can see the difference between what my body's experiencing and my mind's reactions to it.
Yeah, that's right.
And my sense is when students or practitioners hear that, there's something you touched on where it's like people sort of expect that the conditions that they're experiencing when they're mindful will suddenly get better. And you even hinted that, like, just tracking what's going on in my body when my neighbor knocks the door is going to help me balance a little bit. But sometimes there's situations where those sensations don't come down. A lot of times they don't for me. And I still think there's value in being able to differentiate. And that's what I'm asking you right now. How do you differentiate between feelings and sensations and then the stories that come off that?
Okay. So I think we should start by first saying, and I got into this a moment ago, is that our habit is to deny our feelings, or to deny the body sensations and deny the feelings. Most of us come from a place where the people around us, when we grew up, weren't in touch with what they were feeling in their body or their emotions. So we're that's our default, is just ignore it. What meditation practice and conscious communication skills do is they assist us in becoming aware of what's going on in the body. So the first level is just feeling the body, feeling like right now I feel calm. I could describe a few places in my body that are tense, but I can just get a sense that my overall sense is at rest and calm. I feel sort of peaceful inside. No strong sensations. And if something occurred, if somebody walked in the door with a gun, that would change. And I would have body sensations. My heart might start beating fast. My jaw might get tight. My stomach might feel like it's in a knot. So those are physical sensations. And that's the first level to recognize, for self-awareness, for self-care, is to know, oh, I'm not neutral anymore. And what I call it is emotionally charged, right? And that's not my word. A lot of people use that. And it's a good word because you feel a charge in your body. So notice the charge. That charge is indicating that one or more of your basic needs isn't being met. It's a very simple idea. I invite you to explore it on your own, because like any idea, it's not going to be useful until you realize it, until you see it for yourself. It's like a koan, but it's a good one to hold. Is emotional charge means, like, just think of it. If I'm scared, my need for safety isn't being met. A very simple one is, if there's a rumbling in my stomach, oh, I'm hungry. All right, a need for food. So our body sensation, if there's a dryness in my throat, oh, I need water. Okay, if there's our body sensations indicate basic needs, and the physical ones are more obvious, the emotional ones are often less so, but it's the same. And that's to bring this just very simply back to the full circle. How do we get to happiness? How we get to happiness is when our needs are met. When our needs are met, we're happy and we're peaceful and we're good and life is good. And that's the end game, isn't it? So you can't do that if you don't have a way to recognize when your needs aren't being met and then identify what they are. So to go from a body sensation, like my heart's beating fast, to naming an emotion. The reason to name the emotion is it'll help me understand the need. So my heart's beating fast. Oh, I'm scared. Fears the emotion. You don't have to be right about it. It's not about getting it right. It's about, okay, if I'm scared, then what's my need? Oh, I don't feel safe. I need safety. It's a very simple. I'm not suggesting that we can all do this in the moment, but I'm suggesting that this is a direction to head in, because this is how we get to happiness. This is how we learn about ourselves. This is basic self-care. And this is what emotions are for. This is what body sensations and emotions are for, is they're telling us to take care of ourselves. It's a signal to turn your attention inward and take care of yourself. And when people use that phrase, I feel that, or I feel like, those are two phrases that will automatically lead to a story, a thought. So what we're doing there is we're using the word feel and in place of the word thought. What we really mean is, I think that this is happening. And I just got it when you were expressing it, because it's something I teach regularly, is when you say I feel, follow it by an emotional word. I feel scared. I feel hurt. I feel sad. I feel upset. If you don't know a better word, upset's a good one, or uncomfortable. Very good generic, but not I feel that or I feel like, because then you're getting into a story. And I think the reason we do that is that feelings we can be more authoritative about. I know what I feel.
I'm the expert on my own
I'm
feeling,
the expert
and
on my own feeling.
how dare you challenge
I
me,
dare
because
you
I'm the
challenge
owner.
me.
I have my own experience. It's my lived experience.
Yes.
God damn it.
Yes. Whereas if I say I think, then you can say, well, you just think that. But and that's key, because if we use the feeling word as it's meant to be, the word feel indicates, emotion. And we use the word thought, thinking, as it's meant to be. The word thought indicates story. If we use the word feeling, we are in authority. And that's the beautiful thing about it. If I say to you, I feel uncomfortable, there's nobody can challenge that. That's not good or bad or right or wrong. And it doesn't make you good or bad or right or wrong. It's just an indication of what's going on in me. You mentioned a feeling word. I feel betrayed. That's not the word you used, but that's not a word that I would condone in that kind of communication, because that immediately implies blame. But I would ask the person, what's the emotion that comes up when you feel betrayed? I feel hurt. I feel angry. Those are raw emotions. So if I tell you I feel hurt, I feel angry, I am an authority about it. I can say that with absolute certainty. That's my truth. And it's a way that we can ground ourselves in what's true for us. And that's when we need some skills, what I call conscious communication, to enable us to differentiate between that and the story. And one last thing I'll say is that how you can tell that your mind is in story is that stories have a victim and a villain. It's the most basic component of a story. I mean, look at any movie, any story, any book, any novel, any fictional or non-fictional story that has a victim and a villain. That's the nature of story. It's what story is about. It's what drama is about. And when you notice your mind lining things up that way, that, oh, it's usually I'm the victim and that person's the villain, then you know you're in story. And that's not good or bad. It just means that you're not taking care of yourself. And you've gone beyond the level of feeling sensation in the body, naming the emotion, and then identifying the need. You've missed that entirely. And now I'm in the story of who's right and who's wrong, and nobody's taking care of me. I'm not focused on what's going on in my body. I'm not associating it with a raw emotion like scared, and I'm not connecting it with a need like safety. And therefore, how could that need get met? I'm not even focused. So that's the simple kind of formulaic. And of course, we're going to miss it over and over and over again. But what I love about it is it gives me something to shoot for. Like in yoga, it gives me something to lean into. If you go to yoga class and you're trying to be as limber as the teacher, you're probably going to hurt yourself, right? And that's not the point. Any good teacher will say, it's not about how far you can stretch at all. It's about where your edge is. And the same thing here. So wherever you can apply this, that's fine. Wherever you can know, if it's that suddenly you notice I've been in story for the last 20 minutes, I've been demonizing this person, ranting in my mind about how evil they are. Isn't that interesting? Wherever you wake up, wherever you notice it, that's perfectly fine.
I had sent you an article that was in the New York Times about 4 phrases, I think was the title, 4 phrases to diffuse conflict in relationship. And it was similar to your formula for conscious communication. But one of the phrases was identify a fact, like this event happened, short, concise, similar to how you describe it. You identify and you name your own feeling, I felt or I feel, and just the simple raw emotion. But the next phrase, which I found interesting, I've been playing with it myself, is my mind made up this story. So that's the structure of the sentence. My mind made up this story. So if you're talking to someone, you might say, I noticed you left the plate out. I felt this twinge in my stomach, or I felt uncomfortable, and my mind made up a story that you were being sloppy, lazy, you're oblivious, not being mindful. My mind made up this story. And then their suggestion was to try to then move towards a collaborative way to address the need that wasn't being addressed. By using that phrase, my mind made up this story, I've been trying to do it as a tool and just in regular conversation. There's several emotions that come up as I do it. And I just want to narrate a little bit of that.
Yeah.
One is there's an initial feeling of vulnerability in that I'm letting go. I'm admitting that I've just made up a story. I'm basically showing my hand of my deck of my cards and showing I've made up a story with these, and I feel like I'm bringing a level of doubt to my own perception because I'm calling it a story. Okay, so that's one part of it. When I do it, so basically I'm admitting I might not be right here. Very, very directly, I'm admitting I might not be right. But by saying I made up a story about it, I've noticed that whoever I say it around isn't as charged about the topic. And so I can see, even though I don't feel comfortable saying that phrase, and I feel like I'm conceding my stake in being right, I can see that the impact of that statement is that there's less conflict. There's less charge in the dynamic. And I find that interesting. I've been encouraging meditators that I work with, just listen, what kinds of stories can you differentiate between the feeling you're having and the stories your mind is making up about those? And so I just want to add that phrase has been helpful. And I want to also just simply add too, that calling it doesn't mean there isn't quote unquote value or legitimacy or truth in it. And I think there's a tendency in the cultures that I've been in for people to say, that's just story, silly. don't even pretend it, don't even listen to it. It's just story. So that phrase, the word just comes in, and then the whole thing is minimized and I think disregarded, and there's a baby in the bathwater situation. And so maybe I'd like to hear what you think about this, like a use of a phrase like that, my experience with it. How does naming the story and knowing that this is a story actually help us be better able to work with the story, not the real story, but work with the various stories that are at play, and come to a
Great. Yeah. Beautiful topic. So greater resolution, just pick up on the very last thing you said. What's the end game? What is greater resolution? Is personal happiness. Is, I feel good. I feel at peace. That's the resolution. The resolution is I feel good about me and I feel good with you, or I can, accept you. I don't want to kill you. Buddha's definition of love was non-aversion.
You said non-aversion?
Non-aversion. That's my understanding, which is very, sounds so dry, but it's beautiful. If I'm not trying to kill you, if I don't want to kill you, then I accept you. So that's resolution is I feel okay. And how I define that in terms of the communication model is my needs are being met right now. And that I would invite all of us to consider, isn't that the thing we want? That's what we're after. So I love that phrase that was in that article, and I love that you're using that. My mind made up this story. And I love how you're framing it, that if you are willing to acknowledge that to yourself, even, and then if you're willing to acknowledge it to someone else, it's an extremely vulnerable moment, because what you're doing in my language is you're pulling the rug out from under the ego. You're taking away the foundation of the ego when you do that. The foundation of the ego is I'm right and you're wrong. That's how the ego defines itself. It's what we've been talking about in this episode. And when you consider that this is maybe just a story that I made up, you're ripping the foundation. You're pulling the foundation. So it's going to feel very uncomfortable. It's going to feel insecure for most of us. It's that there's going to be a warning alarm saying, don't do that. What are you, crazy? Don't do that. Also, you're showing your hand. You're showing your hand. Don't show your hand. You never show your hand. But what's beautiful is that as soon as we have the courage to do that, even just to yourself, say, look at this story my mind's making up. You diminish the power of the ego to control you. And when you do that, the level of conflict immediately subsides, because the ego is equated with conflict. So it immediately subsides. And the thing we miss in all that ego posturing and being right is our need to connect, our need for connection, our need to feel belonging with the person we're with. As soon as the conflict starts to subside, the tension, you feel that sense of connection with them. And that meets your need for connection. It meets your need for belonging to a bigger whole. So we're nourishing ourselves, and when we pull the rug out from under the ego, when we do that, and it's a great practice. It's a really good practice, and it's a way that we just weaves us right back to the beginning of the show. This is a way to take meditation out into the world, because I think those of us that meditate, one thing we can all hopefully agree on is that what we're learning is not to follow every story in our mind. That's what meditation is. You see the story, you let it go, and you come back to your breath. That's the simple practice of insight meditation. And what we're learning is that we don't believe every story. I can let a story go. It's just a story. That's how meditation teaches us. And when you can verbalize that in your relationships with other people, you're bringing that into your relationship. It's a beautiful way to. And then it can, and I think it would, in most cases, open up the conversation for meeting the need. And I agree with you. It doesn't help to just throw the story out and say, oh, that's just a story. If I'm telling a story and there's an emotional charge, it means there's a need that isn't being met. And I'm trying to get that need met by telling the story. This is the thing. And so the story has value because I'm trying to express a need. It's just that through the ego programming, it comes out as blaming you. And what I'm trying to point out is that only feeds ego. It doesn't help me meet my need. But embedded in the story is the emotion, the raw emotion, and the need. And so what we do in conscious communication is we just use the part of the story that's factual, and then we ask, what's the emotion? What's the raw emotion? And what's the impact on me? That's how we get to the need, is how is this situation affecting me? So with your neighbor with the gun, and this is a very if scenario, I feel really scared when I hear continuous gun firing on your land because I'm concerned that a stray bullet could come to my house or come to me when I'm walking. So that's a simple way to express your vulnerability. You start with your vulnerability. I feel scared. And all of your conditioning is going to be, do not say that to your neighbor. You don't, the old posturing is you never show your cards in a conflict. You don't, you want to have the upper hand. You don't ever want to be vulnerable. But the beauty, the wisdom of leading with vulnerability, leading with saying, I feel scared, or leading with saying, my mind makes up a story, and this is the story, is that you neutralize the other person. That then doesn't have to be so scared of you, because as much as you're scared of the neighbor, and as much as this, I'm going to guess this neighbor doesn't come across as a fearful person. They probably come across as a really strong, gun people tend to be very like, I'm tough. But underneath that, they're scared. And they're as scared of you as you are of them. And if you lead with a vulnerable emotion like, I feel scared, or a admission like, my mind makes up a story, that then that person doesn't have to be as afraid of you. Their fear level automatically goes down. And I think that's what you feel when you do that in a conversation.
As I'm listening to you, Miles, I'm aware of several things. One, we're coming to sort of the max ceiling of our time limit that we set. We could talk over if we want, but I know in light of that, we're going to have more ongoing conversations. I just flagged, how do we get our needs met? I'm flagging this issue of needs being met because I think one of the stories that gets in the way of getting needs met is the story that I can't get my needs met unless they do something. Yeah. And that was one with my neighbor. I know it's like people, it shows up in all very different ways, but I think that's a question that we could explore, because I think it relates to, ultimately, the needs getting met also relates to the sort of the heart of the Buddhist Dharma of awakening. That ultimately our needs are, I would say, are never met until there's a clear taste, a beginning of a taste of what it means to be free. And that's something that I think we could continue to explore. But I just want to maybe wrap up with this phrase, like, my mind made up a story. As I was listening to you speak about it, some clarity around the dynamic at play, like what the dynamic, like the conflict is like before that statement is said, the statement deployed into the dynamic, and then the ensuing impact of that statement. And it's, as I was listening to you, something what one of my old teachers, Rodney Smith, used to say is like, when he didn't use this phrase, but like the idea of our energy, when our energy is flowing into a sense of self, it's investing in a sense in the story that it's holding. Like, as its energy flows into its own story, it becomes, as you've said in other ways, it becomes stronger. And when the energy flows to, say, sensation, that contracted energy of selfness dissipates. And so I just got listening to, I had a greater appreciation for what's at play here. And that when the story is alive and being spun and really believed, and there's a sense of certainty of selfhood that arises with it, I'm right, the I am rightness. That's inversely, when that's strong, it's like a seesaw. When that goes up, the ability to see clearly and more balanced and broadly outside of one's own biases just goes way down. So I guess what I'm acknowledging is, when we let go of, we acknowledge the story for what it is, let go of being right within the story, it can feel like we're ceding, we're losing ground, we're vulnerable, as I said. But I want to underline how you described it. It's like we're then our energy can pour into different mode of being in which we're not caught, we're not reactionary as much. We're able to access a different, broader perspective that would allow us to take another person's perspective. And this is something we've talked about before. Another thing I would flag is that along those themes, something I want to talk more about because it comes up in my own conversations. When we take the perspective of another to understand it, so frequently people think we're condoning it. Like when we take on someone else's perspective, not take it on, but when we try to see how they see something and reflect back the way they see it, there's a tendency for somebody else to say we're now condoning, agreeing, believing, sanctioning, whatever. And it's, so there's a difference between understanding and agreeing that is another level of differentiation that I think, well, we'll loosely call the awakened heart needs to learn how to grow into for these kinds of engagements. And I want to leave the final word with you. I don't know what you think the title of this episode should be, but I think something along the lines of like how to love thy neighbor is in it somehow. How to love thy neighbor, which is different from liking your neighbor.
Okay.
And so I don't necessarily need to agree with why my neighbor wants to have a gun range and all those things, but and I'm not saying I love my neighbor, but I do know that there's a pain that I feel there's a suffering in my life when I am aware of aversion, to use your definition of awakening. When there's aversion in my heart, when there's contention in my heart, I am suffering, and that's independent of him. I mean, I can say he's the proximate cause, but it's ultimately my pain, my own suffering. And I think it sounds like an old biblical thing, but loving thy neighbor right now is a topic that I think we all have to figure out, because I also think of the personality Bill Maher said, whatever the outcome of this election is, I do not want to hate half the country. And whatever the outcome of this election is, the proximate conditions or the causes that are alive right now, the conditions that are alive right now, they're not going to go away. The tribalism that's here is going to be the tribalism on November 6th. And it doesn't matter who wins. And the question is, how do we start to heal and pull back from? And then those are obviously conversations we can continue to explore. But do you have any final thoughts on loving thy neighbor?
Sure. I that phrase came to me as well. It's a bit
Christian.
I mean, I love that it's Christian. Jesus has been a very powerful, beautiful teacher in my life. That part I don't have a problem with. It's just that we're talking a lot in this episode about stretching and where we can and can't imagine ourselves, and loving your neighbor in your particular situation would be, for most people, impossible or nearly impossible. So I maybe a better way to phrase it is keeping your heart open when you're threatened. How to keep your heart open when you're threatened, when you feel threatened. And I think that's what we're talking about here is, can I disagree with you? Can I have a different opinion? Can I have a different strategy? Can I even be in a situation where your actions seem threatening to me? And can I acknowledge, keeping my heart open means acknowledge that we're still, in spite of all that, we're still part of one whole, what I call, one whole conscious mind, one whole being, one whole, we could say humanity. We're still part of one whole. And the reason, again, let's end by this, because it can't be said enough, that that's not about being holy or righteous or saintly or good. It's about getting your need met for connection and belonging. If I can't keep my heart open, to my enemy, someone who I see as threatening me, if I can't keep my heart open, I diminish myself because part of me is cut off.
Is there an old book by like Dale Carnegie, like Winning Friends and Influencing People, or Getting to Yes, or something like? Have you heard of those titles?
Yeah, those are getting to. Dale Carnegie was, I don't, his thing was more for business people.
Yeah.
But he really pioneered some of this stuff. Getting to Yes is the seminal book that we studied in mediation training back in the 80s. It may be different now, but it was one of the clearest books on this idea that both people can win in a conflict. The idea of win-win conflict came from that book, Getting to Yes. So that's a seminal.
I'm thinking of it just because the title coming to me is "Getting Your Needs Met" is really this question, and I think people are going to have that question listening, or at least I have it right now. I want to for our next. I'm going to flag this for our next chat.
Yeah.
Because I think it's the next step. Is so many people, I think, and myself included, think our needs being met means someone else is going to read their script the way we want them to read the script we've written for them.
That's right.
And what is getting our needs met when it doesn't involve getting someone else to do something different?
Yeah.
I think that's a question that we can probably have a whole episode on next time.
Yeah.
But, hey, I do feel better for everyone listening. There's a lot of people I've met and a lot of people I've spoken to, and you're one of these that has such a great perspective on the Dharma and its integration into daily life that it's an honor to have you here. I'm loving that we're going to continue to have these conversations, and I'm going to be getting a lot of good feedback on them. So all the listeners should stay tuned for the sessions with Miles and Josh, and get them wherever you get your podcasts. But thank you, Miles. Great to see you,
Josh. Good to see you.
Stay tuned.
All right.
We'll ring off for now.
All right.